And welcome to the Cape Town Press Club at Home, brought to you this time with the support of Penguin Books, and also thanks to our technical producer, Margriet Groenewald. Our guest today is Amabungane journalist Dewald van Rensburg, who, when he was at the City Press with his colleague Sipho Masondo, broke the story of what the South African Reserve Bank would later call the Great Bank Heist. The collapse of VBS Mutual Bank saw 3.5 billion rand disappear, most of it public funds, much of it untraceable. The political shockwaves are still being felt. Arrests and prosecutions of those involved continue, and at least one has been sentenced already. Van Rensburg has now brought together years of his dogged investigation into the fraud and corruption that led to the demise of the bank in a new book, VBS, A Dream Defrauded. He gives a very detailed and often gobsmacking account of the demise of the bank. So let's welcome him into our virtual studio, Dewald van Rensburg.
Hi. It's
Hi,
only a
Dewald.
pleasure.
And congratulations on the book.
Thank you.
The title of your book, with its echoes of Langston Hughes, and of course Mark Visser's Thabo Mbeki biography, A Dream Deferred. So, A Dream Defrauded. It's an unexpected book about a financial nightmare. Can you tell us, what was the dream? What was the dream of VBS?
First of all, I have to apologize. There's a contractor in the background. I don't know if you can hear him at a neighbor's place. Look, the title reflects what I hope will be apparent in the book, which is that I'm trying to place the defrauding and collapse of VBS within context. And that context is what I think has become a widespread belief or feeling in this country, especially amongst young people, that empowerment transformation has failed. That there is this dream expressed within some quarters that VBS encapsulated. It was to be a very successful and appeared to be a very successful black-owned financial services company in the making. It had a great ambition. On paper, it looked like it was growing spectacularly and becoming spectacularly profitable. It was to be the centerpiece of a larger financial group, and one that had nothing to do with the empowerment deal, built from the ground up by an impressive slate of black professionals. And in that context, it really embodied, I think, a widespread ambition in South Africa.
Yeah. Well, before we go into the story of the Dreamers, which I think will be our next focus, I just think as we recount what happened to this bank, maybe you could just tell us. Let's look at what were the real world consequences. What was the result of this looting? Have in mind the Stokvels that lost money, the burial societies, those queues we saw of poor people sleeping outside of banks, desperate, having to draw a couple of hundred rand that they still might have in their accounts. What have the effects been, and also on municipal service delivery?
Well, it's precisely the two legs that I hope to invoke. The dream that is, bludgeoned. And on the other side, the direct effect on people who banked at the bank and people who were employed by the bank. So it had a large clientele. For a small institution, you had 17,000 odd retail depositors, 1,300 odd Stokvels, which sometimes had significant savings for poor people, like R1 million each, and so on. That damage is the most immediate and, I suppose, damaging, although it reflects a relatively small fraction of the money lost. The largest damage, quantitatively, obviously, is at municipalities that lost about 1.5 billion rand. There was also money lost by the Public Investment Corporation, 400 million rand. And there were also companies, small companies, with another 200 odd million rand in the bank. So a lot of people lost their money. It wasn't just the very visible and very distraught poor people we saw queuing and sleeping outside branches. The point to make is that they, amongst all the people who lost their money, were the most vulnerable. It's a great deal more damaging for someone to lose 1,000 rand if that's the only 1,000 rand they have, as opposed to someone losing 1,000 rand when he has someone who could spend that on a night out, obviously. So there's a sense of proportion. And when you look at the clientele this bank had, it really is predominantly people with small amounts of savings and small amounts of money in their transactional accounts. And losing access to those is immediately devastating. You have people who then, they can't withdraw money just to do their basic stuff. You're not going to be able to buy groceries in that first week. So there's a case to be made for an incredibly devastating effect.
Mm. And and there were a few near misses as well, which you reveal in the book. I mean, Prosper nearly had an opportunity to throw away another R1 billion down the bank. And in this FAS, I mean, almost all the student funding could have disappeared. The whole university fees for students came very close to vanishing. Yeah,
so near the end of 2017, and this is something I only learned in researching the book, VBS and Standard Bank in conjunction won a tender that they would be the administrators of an e-wallet system that dispersed NSFAS funding to students. These, of course, are students who rely entirely on NSFAS funding to pursue their studies. Now, the total tender involved the distribution of about 35 billion rand. It is not entirely clear which proportion of that VBS had, but it most certainly had been in VBS, and through its distribution, if it had gone down the drain with the collapse of the bank, it would have been a disaster for our higher education system.
Yeah, something also which you revealed in the book, which I hadn't been aware of and should have been, was that the origins of the bank go back to the old apartheid Bantustan, and that the vendor king played a key role. I mean, he gets 51% of the bank without paying a cent for his shares. And if you have a bank and you have a king, then you might as well have a church as well. So you described one chapter called God's Bank, mobilizing religious networks such as the Nazareth Baptist Church, 3 million adherents, I think. So what was the role? What role did these structures play from our society in terms of traditional leadership and churches and religion?
Well, there's a bit of history because the bank was founded by the king at the time of Venda, who was also the president of the Venda Republic. So there was this royal genealogy, and this was highly symbolic to bring him in as a major shareholder once VBS was acquired by the group that eventually sank the bank. And I think he did not provide capital. So the reason you would want to bring in the king was to cloak the thing in this kind of nationalist aura, of course. You were branding this as a vendor bank, as something tied to this nation, a bank for the nation, a bank for the chiefs around whom they could rally. And that's a theme that ran through the bank's, the short bank history since for the last 5 years or so of its existence. A real attempt at a kind of cultural marketing of the bank. And the king also sits in a really concrete network in Limpopo. A lot of people met each other and got involved with VBS through the intermediation of the king. So one person knows the king, another person knows the king, and that's how they get to meet each other, and then ultimately together come into VBS. That's how the so-called mastermind of the fraud, Sipho Masondo and his colleagues, ultimately got to buy shares in the bank because they say they got involved with David Mabilu, a well-known businessman in Limpopo. There was a link via the king. David Mabilu knew the king. He didn't know Masondo, and it was on the strength of the king's endorsement that he provided capital that they needed to buy the shares in VBS to begin with.
And the church?
The church, well, VBS had good ideas. It had good ideas along the way. Whether those good ideas were sincere, which is the way to acquire more cash, which would be misappropriated, is a fair question. I think most people would lean towards the latter. But these were usually mass-based ideas to get to dramatically increase the mass base of retail clients. So when we spoke about 17,000, they were hoping to create a partnership with the Nazareth Baptist Church initially, which would have involved, excuse me, a system whereby the membership card of a church member would in fact be a VBS Bank card. Ludicrously ambitious, probably impossible given the state of their infrastructure, but nonetheless, a plan set down in agreements, signed off by people. They went and met the leaders of the church. There was an involvement there. I mean, these are the kind of plans that people in the bank had. And I think the reason a lot of these failed was it's because they didn't have the technology for it. And that was what they were hoping to build over time.
Right. Yes, what's quite nice about your book is, although you're very clear in terms of what the fraud and the corruption was, I do like the fact that it's not too overtly condemnatory. It's you have some understanding for them. So let's just maybe talk about these perpetrators, the people who are accused. And you also had some really candid interviews and some extraordinary access. But it was overall, whatever, it might have been sincere about trying to build something, but at the same time, it was really a Ponzi scheme. I think that's the word you use. It's a trail of backhand commissions, bribe, outright forgery, fake contracts, fake minutes, no contracts, boardroom backstabbing and manipulations, smoke and mirrors, shell companies within companies, and cross holdings. Makes one wonder what they teach students at accountancy school. Like all went up to see Enron the musical.
They teach them well, evidently.
Yes, taught them very well. So tell us about the perpetrators. What were their career trajectories, like Matsodi, the chairperson, and Ramavunga, the CEO?
Well, there's a number of chartered accountants involved, highly educated people. I make the point that many of the kind of central clique met each other at university, where they were all accounting students at the same time. So from there, some of them also walked a corporate path together. But before that, in order to be a chartered accountant, obviously you go and you do your articles at accountancy firms. Matotsi was at Ernst & Young, I believe, I recall. The CEO of VBS, Andile Ramabunga, also walked the path of a chartered accountant, perfectly standard kind of career trajectories for people of their generation. So Matotsi afterwards went into business. He went into business with a friend of his who also got involved in VBS, doing municipal work, municipal tendering, doing IT work specifically. Matotsi being the CFO. Andile Ramabunga, for instance, he was the CEO of a number of state institutions, including Itala Bank in KwaZulu-Natal before moving to VBS. So, and we have some really well-known vendor businessmen. Again, we say they were drawn in by the involvement of the king to some extent, including Robert Matsonga, who had been an figure at MTN, moved there from a bit of a cloud. Manda Manyata, who was the CEO of the post office, MTN as well, well-known businessman. So, I mean, there's a golden line of a lot of people being, quite impressive people. A lot of people were then also old-timers at the bank, people who had worked there a long time. This was, for instance, Philip Truter, the CFO, who is now the only convicted member of the gang. But I've also, there are also other members who've been there a long time. You've got to understand that people who had worked, quietly at this bank, had uneventful careers within VBS when it was a small institution. They were there when these new guys showed up. And I've been made to understand by people that they didn't really know what to do, because suddenly the culture changed. It was clear that these guys were, breaking down controls and benefiting themselves and so on. But it's a small town, Mercado, where the headquarters was. You don't just quit your job because you're not going to find another one with relevant requirements to your experience working at a small bank. So a lot of people just kind of sat there and had to make do with it because they didn't see themselves as having other options. So I mean that people have asked, like, how did this stay contained, and how was why wasn't this a great deal of whistleblowing before this thing collapsed? And I think that has to do with it. I think there's fear, there's people protecting their careers as well.
Yes, and that comes across, and I think you actually interviewed some people who were exactly in that situation. And I think one of the women accountants who says that, what other job am I going to get here?
Yeah.
But also you say that they were quite charming, and in fact, the Stellenbosch Billionaire Club, they instrumentalized GT Ferreira and JP du Plessis in their plans, who were looking for a BEE partner. So they said they were terribly charming, and they fell for them. But let's just take it a step further. I mean, how gullible are we? I mean, they make it all the way to Davos. So it's an extraordinary amount of regulatory failure. And I think we need to, maybe let's talk about that next. The KPMG auditors, the National Treasury, the Financial Services Commission, the South African Reserve Bank, the Auditor General. Where were they?
Well, I think I've spoken to every single one of those. Well, we start with KPMG. The audit partner in charge of VBS's books, Sipho Masondo, he's been arrested. He's one of the main accused, faces, I think, 24 charges or so. He was bribed to look the other way. He was bribed to ignore the fact that there was almost R1 billion in cash on books that didn't exist at all. And this was flagged by his subordinates. The accountancy works this way. You have clerks, article clerks, first years, second years, third years, they do the actual work. And cash accounting is simple. The first year looks at the accounts, calls up the bank where this cash supposedly is, and then says, well, yes, it's there. Fine. Couldn't do that. Flagged it, said, look, I can't find the cash. It went up the line till Sipho said, I'll take care of it, which he did by signing off on fake accounts. So you have the auditor in the back, and you have that by paying him a lot of money. He got more money than many executives. So his reward was proportionally quite large. Okay, order this out of the way. Then you have the Reserve Bank. Now, the mutual bank is a very lightly regulated entity. It's not like a normal bank. Cuban Naidu, the registrar of banks, has gone before Parliament effectively apologizing for this, saying, look, there's like 2 or 3 mutual banks in the country. We tend to just believe the auditors when it comes to these banks. We're talking about small institutions. It's something that hadn't almost fought to look at for fraud. I don't think that will be the case anymore, obviously. But that was the failure. They really just didn't think they had to. It just flew under the radar. Auditor General. So a lot of people asked the question, when these municipalities put all this money in VBS, and it was legal to do so, because the Municipal Finance Management Act forbids you from investing money in anything that's not a real bank. Hence, not explicitly, but implicitly by exclusion, you can't invest in a mutual bank. And one would imagine that the financial managers at municipalities are aware of this. Now, sometimes I think, honestly, they weren't aware of it, but nonetheless did it. And it would be reflected in their accounts, and the Auditor General would be looking at those accounts and be able to say, look, the money can't be where it is. Now, that's a very idealistic view of how municipal accounts work. And half the municipalities in this country are completely dysfunctional. They don't produce annual reports. And when they do, those reports are in shambles. I've looked for the annual reports of most of the municipalities involved there. You can't find them. Some of the big ones, they have proper annual reports. They reflect that money had moved to VBS, and they make no other note of disclosure about it. So in that instance, maybe you can say, okay, Auditor General, why didn't you pick that up? I asked them, they said, look, the municipalities are such a mess. We are looking for far bigger things than where you're depositing your money. We're looking at theft of money on a grand scale at many municipalities. Like, this is something that will almost inevitably fly under the radar so far as the Auditor General is concerned. Yeah, I mean, those would have been the main authorities, and then the last mechanism, kind of the key mechanism, given what I've said, would have been the independent directors on this board, who either didn't see anything or were bribed to not see anything. Now, this is especially true of the audit committee, the people who would have looked at the finances. The key members there were bribed. The independent directors were employed by the Public Investment Corporation as the other major shareholder. Both of them were bribed because they might have been expected to, on behalf of a major shareholder, exercise a little, extra diligence, which they didn't at all do. They also blame Sipho Masondo for the fact that they didn't see anything. So that's a failure of a key institution as well, which is an independent board, the auditor, the Reserve Bank, and the Auditor General, for various reasons.
Right. Well, another bit of marketing that they did, and that was, I think, like most South Africans, I first heard about the existence of this obscure little bank in Limpopo when it popped up to extend a loan to Jacob Zuma for the 7.8 million of the 246 million spent on his house that he had to pay back, and on which he very soon defaulted at VBS. But there were other political connections, mostly ANC bigwigs, like Danny Mvisa, who I think would say today had 164 million in personal assets of private wealth. And who had his name expunged from Matau's Reserve Bank report, the Great Bank Heist. They took it to court. But you name him numerous times. I think there's actually a passage I will just read very quickly. It's very short. You say, after the fact, it is obvious that VBS slotted into pre-existing political networks and infused them with a new source of patronage. At the top were provincial ANC bosses. In the middle were ANC deployed mayors. At the bottom were career municipal officials who are equally beholden to the ruling party for their jobs. So what role did cadre deployment play? And you've also said that a number of these officials that were then removed or told to step down, it's been musical chairs. They've just popped up elsewhere in also significant, important positions, but somewhere else.
Okay, so about the political network that it's slotted into. It has to be said that the Zuma loan, first of all, was an ingenious piece of marketing. It shot a flare into the sky that it did a lot of business, not all fraudulent business. People earnestly supported the bank, thinking it was a fairly radical agent for transformation. Some of that is, not a smokescreen. But when it comes to people who actually aided and abetted the bank, this goes up to, like I said, provincial level. There is no indication just yet that national ANC figures were concretely involved. So Daniel Caesar is interesting because he went, took that report to court, even though he has mentioned barely, 2 times, and his involvement isn't discussed in any great detail. But still, he thought that was damaging enough. And of course, his name was then, latched on in the media. But all the evidence against him subsequently came, to light in the court case against the report, where Temitau then had to produce the evidence he relied on, which was quite a lot. And I reproduce a lot of that in the book. And it's a fascinating, damning read. So there's that. The power to deploy is interesting because what you would have is the people who would have to make the decision to put money in EBS. You'd have maybe 3 people at any municipality with that power. It would be illegitimate for the mayor to do it, but the mayor can command the functionaries to do it. You have the municipal manager, who is the boss, technically. You have the CFO beneath them. Those two individuals should be in charge. They should know where the money is going. Municipal managers move all the time. So some of the people, some of the managers who were municipalities that invested had previously left other municipalities under cloud and then appeared in another place, and subsequently have done the same. So there's been frightfully little consequence for people at that level of government. In fact, I think almost none. A couple of people have been disciplined, suspended. Some, astonishingly, have gotten golden handshakes to leave. It's hard to pin people down at municipal level. Like I said, it's an incredibly murky and dirty level of government, very unaccountable. Now, the interesting thing about VBS is that it shows you a kind of subset of how a municipal network works, which clearly isn't confined to VBS. I mean, it shows you kind of how these things work, which it's enlightening. It's enlightening when you see how VBS paid people, the way in which it was done, which is literally with bags of money, with EFTs. You just pay a guy, and you can, through evidence we have, email trails, see how individuals really bent over to move money at very short notice into VBS. I mean, there is a beholdenness that's very formal almost. So to take that point a little further, I mean, the political story around VBS, I mean, we're expecting more arrests. And what we've seen is the arrest of the main bank executives, board members. We've seen the arrest of the auditor. We have seen the arrest of only one municipal official. It's kind of flown under the radar, and that's Thys Winnekes. Now, Thys Winnekes was a fairly low-level, unimportant man working at the Merafong municipality. He was acting CFO for all of 2 or 3 days, but in those 2 or 3 days, the municipal manager ordered him to put 50 million rand in VBS. He did that, and on the basis of doing that, he got arrested now. One might say that's very unfortunate for him, but I mean, he did commit a crime. He did contravene the act governing municipal investments. But it seems to be a fairly strategic arrest. The reason for that being they could very easily charge a large number of other municipal functionaries on the same charge, simply because they demonstrably invested money in VBS. There have been forensic investigations at most of the municipalities. They're not, they're not official state or police investigations. They were done by auditing firms by and large. There was one done in Limpopo, which kind of is this rogues gallery and just makes the point that 1 or 2 officials at every single municipality there contravened the act. So the fact that only one functionary has been arrested is kind of telling. I think that paves the way for a great deal of other arrests at that level. But the NPA has made it clear that it intends to make more arrests by the end of this year. And to my knowledge, it's going to be 2 or 3 arrests, and among those arrests will be Danny Masiza in all likelihood. It's going to be interesting. It's going to be politically interesting. I think it might be controversial and cause all sorts of problems in Limpopo. A lot of people, of course, are keen to see this hit the EFF. The EFF's involvement in VBS Bank it requires a little thought and a little explanation. I've made the point in the book that the EFF had a small role relatively in VBS. It was almost exclusively ANC deployees and politicians who against whom there is any kind of compelling evidence, or we can show incontrovertibly, I think, I have proof to this effect, that money, about 16 million, was paid to Brian Shavambo, the brother of Floyd Shavambo, and that it was not legitimate in the sense that it was not tied to any kind of loan or written agreement at all. In fact, it flowed indirectly from random accounts. So it's hard to understand how those could be legitimate payments. I mean, they don't express a legal opinion, but that's pretty compelling. The money from there went largely as donations, payments to the EFF and to Brian's brother Floyd. So there is that, obviously. Now, one could speculate as to why the EFF would find favor at VBS. It's obviously the ANC who could control and direct money. But you must understand that Limpopo is an EFF stronghold. At municipal level, it is the province where the EFF got by far the largest proportion of the vote. And specific municipalities that invested in VBS, the EFF has sway. It has a fair amount of seats in council. So there is that. I mean, relative to other parts of the country, the EFF does hold political sway at local government level in Limpopo, which might play a part. And I mean, if you want to have political cover, it doesn't hurt to have another party on your side, or at least members of another party potentially on your side if things went south.
And then the final count, how many municipalities were involved? Sorry, I went down a little while, so I may have missed a little bit of what you said. And I think you said that at each municipality, that at least 3 officials would have had to know, would have been in the loop. Are we, what's happening there in terms of pursuing, and what are the prospects of getting the money back?
So in total, 20 municipalities were involved in that. 20 municipalities at some point put money in VBS. Some of them got all their money out again and lost no money when the thing collapsed. 14 suffered significant damage when the bank was put into curatorship. So the money owed is about 1.5 billion. All these municipalities now stand as creditors in a normal process of liquidation that's ongoing. The odds of getting that money back is pretty much zero. It'll be a very small dividend of cents in the rand when this liquidation is complete. So that's it's a severe blow, because I mean, for some of the smaller ones involved here, it's a significant part of 1 year's operating budget, and some of it was taken from budgets allocated to specific projects, like water infrastructure, things like that. So yeah, insofar as the municipalities are concerned, I mean, there should really be serious consequences, but as I just point out just now, there very rarely are, and it remains to be seen if there are more arrests at that level. I believe there will be.
Yes, no, I mean, I have to say, quite often reading the book, it was the modus operandi was reminiscent of Bosasa. In that, money was just handed out to everybody that was in any way going to be helpful. So a lot of cash has been dished out. It is out there somewhere, and we'll just have to see what happens with the prosecutions. I presume you're going to be following these quite closely.
Yeah, of course. Well, like I said, it goes to trial in January. The rest we know of, and the rest we anticipate within the year. So yeah, that would be something we all, I think, watch very keenly. In terms of dishing out money, so a big problem for the prosecution is going to be following this money, because I mean, to some extent, obviously, you can look at bank records, you can see whose accounts it went to, if it was paid electronically out of VBS, and you could probably subpoena the banks at which those accounts were held, and then see where it went from there. But a lot of it was cash. So, I mean, there's a instance that's quite infamous, because Matau already mentioned it, which is that like a suitcase of 5 million rand cash withdrawn at the Mikado branch of VBS, taken over the teller, over the counter. And that teller was very upset about it and raised an alarm about it. Unfortunately, it got kicked up the line, and the person that the whistle was ultimately blown to was someone who was in on the fraud, Ernest Masane, allegedly, who is the PIC member of the board. So, I mean, that also is a way of containing and controlling fallout. If the people within the line of accountability are bought, as much as you can raise the flag, it ends up in a dead end. But also there are other highly suspicious ways in which money moved. I found some companies where you see kind of classic signs of theft and money laundering in the form of perfectly round numbers being paid off that account in regular intervals into some random account that doesn't seem to have a business purpose, doesn't seem to have any purpose. I found one. I called the apparent owner of the company being paid. He hung up the minute I called. And that person had a historical link to Sipho Masondo as well. So, I mean, the money was moved in a variety of ways. Outside the bank, it was moved in a variety of ways. Inside the bank, in ways that I think I show were designed to kind of obfuscate who was getting money. It's I think, quite a task. I know the internal task of the forensic investigation that the Reserve Bank undertook was quite daunting already.
Yes, one of the reasons why the bank had been below the radar in some ways, you mentioned, was because it was a mutual bank. And what I found quite interesting, and that's just as a little bit of an aside, really, the difficulty then of attaching property, because it would be on communal land, and Kandla being a question. So, what is the situation there with Zuma having defaulted on the loan, the bank having disappeared, somebody's taking over the book of the bad debts? Can you see the property attached, or what would happen there?
Well, fortunately, most of the old home loan book is a good book. It's people who are paying diligently their tiny loans. Zuma's loan, you'd be happy to know the security isn't the land. The security is a lease. It's a title, a 40-year lease he has with the owner of the land, which is the Zulu Kingdom. So that can be seized. And it's interesting because that could make someone the landlord of Jacob Zuma on that 40-year lease.
It's an interesting prospect to think about. We got a comment from Horst Fraser. He says, you've uncovered a huge financial and political scandal. Well done. Have you ever been threatened with your life? I think people always ask this. And how safe is it for uncovering these scandals? Will you be intimidated in the future? Have you been intimidated?
This is a question you get, and I think there's sometimes in a mythology around investigative journalism being these white knights with no concern for their own safety, fighting for democracy with a big sword in their hands. I am essentially a nerd who has spent the last 2 years with bank records. That doesn't get you shot. Now that the book is out, maybe things might be different. There might be legal threats. But I have never had my life threatened. I'll say it up front. I have been stealthily researching, following bank records, following court cases that fly under the radar, calling people from a safe distance. So the likelihood of me having gotten killed in the process of writing this book was very, very slight. People who inform on the people who were involved in all this, the whistleblowers face a very real risk, especially at municipal level. And I think this is going to be a concern when prosecutions happen at that level, because people who testify and provide evidence, I think, will almost automatically qualify for witness protection, because things happen at that level that couldn't at national level.
Right. Well, I've always had the philosophy that, in fact, the more you publish and the more open you are about it, and the more you whistleblow, the less likely you are going to be targeted as a journalist. However, you're quite right. For the real whistleblowers out there, that is a real problem. And in fact, our next meeting for the Cape Town Press Club will be on the 4th of November, the next webinar. We'll be speaking to Mandy Wiener about whistleblowers and whistleblowing. And just sort of thing, I think we're going to wrap up a little bit earlier today than is there anything else you would like to add, or what you're looking forward to writing about? And would you like to get out of bed backwards and move on to something else for a bit?
Look, it's something that I think you can't avoid in covering VBS over the last 2 years and publishing this book, which is a race dynamic that has evolved around it. A lot of people ask the question, why so much attention on VBS when Marcus Jooste is walking free and allegedly gets less media attention, less investigation. I would say, you have to do both. There has been an excellent book on Marcus Jooste, and we have done a fair amount of investigation, but nonetheless, I think that impression is not altogether unfair. And I think the reason is because the victims are so incredibly visible. The victims of Steinhoff are people who have pension and provident funds. It falls under JSE. You didn't have people sleeping on the street, in front of cameras. That incredibly visceral fallout, I think, is what captured the imagination of a lot of people. And VBS, the story to me, the thing that makes it so relevant is the way it demonstrates an intersection of political corruption with corporate fraud, and the way these kind of royal networks were also employed and mobilized. There's just a lot of different things that intersected in VBS in a way that I think is very interesting and telling about how things sometimes work in South Africa. But also, it's a fair question that gets asked about why I wrote this book. I can assure you that a Venda author or any black author would have written it differently. Same facts, obviously, but perhaps a different set of sympathies born out of a more concrete experience of, economic exclusion, something I couldn't possibly understand. And that is relevant to the way I treat characters who speak to me about their aspirations and why they could perceive it as a tragedy that the bank was defrauded and destroyed. I mean, it does color one's perception, one's ability to really fully comprehend people's, so we say, alleged allegiance to a certain transformation project, who then subsequently proved to perhaps just be fraudsters, and to a real investment in a project that was defrauded. I think that's something that you have to fairly say, and which I think I wouldn't mind coloring readers of the book's opinion, but of course, please buy it and make up your mind for yourself, I suppose.
Yes, well, that certainly that brings us full circle, actually, to the dream defrauded, the way you've put it there. It's an excellent book. It's a great read. I can highly recommend it. Congratulations again. We look forward to more coming out of, you're well placed at Amabungane to produce the next one, the sequel. And then maybe you can do VBS the musical. So we'll see. Thank you very much, everybody. And Whistleblowers on the 4th of November. Also, we put up a link so you can click on that and you can buy the book at a discounted price, special offer for the Cape Town Press Club. So please go to the links and we'll be there. Thank you.
Thank you.